They had been told America was soft, weak, divided, materialistic, a country of luxury, not sacrifice, a nation too spoiled, too fractured, too undisciplined to survive a real war. Then the German prisoners arrived, and everything they believed began to collapse. By the time World War II was over, more than 371,000 German POWs had been held in the United States. Many of them were hardened veterans, Afrika Korps men, battle-tested soldiers who had fought for Hitler across deserts, cities, and front lines soaked in blood. They did not come to America expecting to be impressed. They came expecting confirmation, proof that Nazi propaganda had been right all along. Instead, they walked into a civilization operating on a scale they could barely comprehend. This is one of the most remarkable and forgotten stories of the Second World War. Not just how America defeated Nazi Germany with ships, tanks, bombers, and factories, but how it shattered Nazi ideology in the minds of the enemy itself. Because in these prison camps, America was fighting another kind of war, a war for belief, a war for reality. And in the end, it may have won that war more completely than anyone realized. When German POWs were shipped across the Atlantic and brought deep into the American interior, many still carried the worldview they had been raised on under Hitler. They had been trained to see democracy as weak, decadent, and doomed. They believed Germany had discipline, spiritual strength, and historical destiny, while America had only money and comfort. Then they looked out the train windows. What they saw did not fit the story. Vast farmland stretching farther than the eye could follow. Town after town, untouched by ruin. Rail networks moving with astonishing efficiency. Storehouses full. Roads alive with traffic. Electric lights glowing at night in places where, back in Europe, entire cities had gone dark under blackout orders and fear of air attack. For men coming from a continent being torn apart by total war, America didn't look exhausted. It looked enormous, calm, productive, untouchable. And that was only the beginning. These prisoners were distributed across more than 500 camps between 1943 and 1946. Some were held in large base camps, others in branch camps close to farms, mills and factories where their labor could be used. But no matter where they went, they kept running into the same crushing fact. America had more. More land, more food, more machines, more fuel, more roads, more tools, more output, more comfort, more confidence, and worst of all, for Nazi ideology. Ordinary Americans seemed to live better than the elites of Europe. That was a shock few of them were prepared for, because the Nazi system did not just rely on military force, it relied on hierarchy, myth, and comparison. Germans were taught to believe they belonged to a superior civilization, that their sacrifices proved their greatness, that hardship was nobility, that democracies were spiritually empty and structurally inferior. But in America, many POWs encountered something deeply unsettling. Workers who were not aristocrats, not party officials, not military officers, living in decent houses, eating well, wearing clean clothes, driving vehicles, and speaking with a kind of relaxed confidence that did not look like weakness at all. It looked like a system that worked. And then came the factories. This was where the psychological damage to Nazi belief became impossible to ignore. German POWs began witnessing the true scale of American industrial power. Not as an abstract statistic, but as a physical reality. Rail yards loaded with materials, agricultural operations on a scale larger than regions they had known in Europe, endless mechanization, endless motion, endless production. They were seeing the living engine of what Franklin Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. and it was overwhelming. In Germany, propaganda had glorified willpower, sacrifice, and national destiny. But now these prisoners were forced to confront a brutal truth of modern war. Ideology means very little when the other side can build more planes, more trucks, more ammunition, more food, and more fuel than you can destroy. America was producing B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes. Think about what that meant to a German soldier. Not 1 every week, not 1 every few days, 1 every 63 minutes. For men who came from an economy strained to its limits, where shortages, bombing, and logistical breakdown were part of daily life, this was not just impressive, it was demoralizing. It suggested that Germany had not merely been challenged, it had been outclassed, not by propaganda, by output, by systems, by an industrial civilization so large that even in wartime it seemed able to feed itself, arm itself, and still offer ordinary citizens a standard of living many Europeans could not imagine. And inside the prison camps, this realization deepened. The United States did not simply warehouse German POWs behind barbed wire and wait for the war to end. The camps became spaces of controlled observation, labor, exposure, and eventually re-education. The process was not always smooth, and it was not always immediate. Many prisoners remained committed Nazis for a long time. Some enforced Nazi discipline inside the camps, intimidating or even threatening fellow prisoners who showed independent thinking. That internal conflict was real. Within the wire, there were still believers, still fanatics, still men loyal to Hitler even as the Reich began to collapse around them. But America had one enormous advantage. Reality was on its side. The prisoners could compare what they had been told with what they were actually seeing. They could measure Nazi rhetoric against American abundance. They could watch how guards behaved, how civilians lived, how food was distributed, how work was organized, how newspapers discussed politics, how criticism could exist without the whole state collapsing. That mattered. Because authoritarian systems depend on controlling information. They depend on sealing people inside a story, a closed moral universe, a structure where contradiction can be explained away and failure can always be blamed on betrayal, conspiracy, or enemies. But these prisoners were outside that closed system now, and every day in America created more contradiction. They saw a democracy that was not paralyzed. They saw prosperity that was not fake. They saw discipline without totalitarianism. And they saw a country powerful enough to crush Nazi Germany without becoming Nazi Germany. That may have been the deepest shock of all. The regime they had served taught that kindness was weakness, that brutality was strength, that fear commanded respect. But many POWs in America encountered treatment that did not fit that logic. They were enemies, but they were also prisoners under a system governed by rules. They were fed, housed, put to work. Watched closely, yes, but not routinely brutalized in the way many had expected or perhaps would have considered normal under their own regime. That did not mean camp life was pleasant. It was still captivity, still defeat, still humiliation. But it introduced another destabilizing idea, that a nation could be powerful without being savage. For men raised inside a dictatorship built on force, that was a dangerous revelation. And as the war turned decisively against Germany, the contrast only grew sharper. The Reich was collapsing under bombing, invasion, shortages, and internal ruin. Cities were burning, families were scattered, faith in victory was evaporating. The myth of German invincibility was dying. And meanwhile, in America, the POWs were seeing a nation whose productive power seemed almost untouched by the destruction consuming Europe. The more they learned, the harder it became to sustain the old beliefs. This was the turning point. Not a single speech, not one pamphlet, not one dramatic moment where everyone suddenly changed sides. It was slower than that, more human, more devastating. A death by evidence. Bit by bit, the worldview they brought with them began to break apart. Nazi racial mythology, claims about democratic decay, beliefs about German superiority, faith in authoritarian strength, all of it was forced into collision with daily American reality. And reality kept winning. After Germany's surrender, this process intensified. Re-education efforts became more explicit. Prisoners were shown films, exposed to evidence of Nazi crimes, given broader access to alternative political ideas, encouraged to confront what the regime had done and what it had lied about. For some, this was the first full rupture. For others, it only confirmed what they had already begun to suspect. The regime they had served had not led them toward greatness. It had led Germany to catastrophe, and the country they had been trained to despise had revealed another path, one rooted not in racial myth or permanent war, but in productivity, civic order, and political pluralism. Not every prisoner changed. Some never did. Some held on to bitterness, denial, or fragments of the old ideology. But many were transformed, deeply enough that when they returned to Germany, they carried more than memories of captivity. They carried a comparison. They had seen what a functioning democracy looked like at full scale. They had seen industrial power linked to social confidence. They had seen a political order that could tolerate disagreement and still mobilize for total war with extraordinary effectiveness. And that comparison would matter in the world that came after 1945, because the war did not end with surrender alone. It ended with the rebuilding of Germany, a new Germany, a democratic Germany, a Germany that had to be reconstructed not only in its cities and institutions, but in the minds of its people. Some of the men once held in American camps would become part of that future. Former POWs went home changed, and in some cases, they helped shape the post-war order. The story is often told through generals, presidents, and diplomats. But beneath that level was another transformation, quieter, less visible, but incredibly important. The conversion of enemy soldiers into witnesses, witnesses to the failure of Nazism, witnesses to the strength of democracy, witnesses to the sheer force of American modernity. Even the statistics around captivity tell the story. Out of hundreds of thousands of German POWs held in the United States, only around 0.6% attempted escape. That number says something. Not just about geography or security, though both mattered. It also suggests that many prisoners understood the basic truth of their situation. They were not trapped inside a collapsing nightmare. They were inside the strongest nation on earth, a nation they had underestimated so completely that the shock of discovering the truth became its own kind of defeat. And that is what makes this story so powerful. America didn't crush Nazi ideology in these camps by shouting louder than Nazi propaganda. It crushed it by making propaganda look ridiculous, by exposing German prisoners to a society whose strength was visible everywhere, in the farms, in the factories, in the roads, in the homes, in the lights that stayed on, in the bombers rolling off assembly lines, in the confidence of ordinary people living under a free system that could still outproduce and outfight a militarized dictatorship. That was the real lesson. The Nazi state promised strength, but delivered ruin. American democracy promised less drama and delivered overwhelming power. In the end, that may have been one of the greatest strategic victories of the entire war. Not just defeating Germany's armies, not just destroying Hitler's regime, but dismantling the illusion that had sustained it. Because somewhere behind barbed wire in Texas, Arizona, Iowa, or Alabama, a German prisoner looked at America and realized the future did not belong to the creed he had been taught to worship. It belonged to the nation that could build, feed, organize, innovate, endure, and still remain a democracy. That is why this story matters. Because wars are not only won by killing enemy soldiers or taking enemy ground. Sometimes they are won by proving, beyond argument, that the enemy's entire view of the world was false. And in that sense, America did something extraordinary during World War II. It did not just defeat Nazi Germany. It made believers stop believing.